The Ritual of Suffering. The morning Marcus Chen discovered what the Zephyrians called justice, the twin sons of Sirian 7 had just begun their relentless climb across the copper sky. He stood atop the atmospheric processing station, running diagnostics on the filtration arrays that kept their mining colony breathing clean air in this harsh desert world. The work was routine, methodical, and usually offered him peace. Today, it would shatter his understanding of the species humanity had called allies for the past decade. The sound reached him first, a cry that cut through the constant hum of machinery and desert wind, raw and desperate in a way that made his skin crawl. Marcus paused, wrench in hand, listening. The sound came again, weaker but no less haunting. He moved to the platform's edge and looked down toward the Zephyrian settlement that sprawled alongside the human compound. In the center of their communal space, where the morning ceremonies usually took place, a crowd had gathered. At its heart, Marcus could make out a figure chained to a metal post driven deep into the sun-baked ground. Even from this distance, he could see the distinctive silver-scaled skin that marked all Zephyrians, but this one was smaller, more delicate than the others. "You should not watch," came a voice behind him. Marcus turned to see Vostak approaching, his reptilian features creased with what Marcus had learned to recognize as discomfort. The Zephyrian's long tail dragged behind him as he climbed onto the platform, carrying a toolbox that rattled with each step. "What's happening down there?" Marcus asked, though something cold in his stomach already suspected he didn't want to know. Vostak's inner eyelids flickered rapidly, a nervous habit Marcus had observed over their 2 years working together. "The ritual of the burning sands," he said finally. "It is our way. Ancient law." Marcus looked back toward the settlement. The figure at the post had slumped forward, chains holding her upright. Even from this distance, he could tell it was a female, young by Zephyrian standards, judging by her size. "What did she do?" Marcus asked. "She spoke against the elders during council," Vostak replied, beginning to sort his tools with unnecessary focus. "Questioned the allocation of water rights. Said the youth should have voices in such decisions." The simplicity of it hit Marcus like a physical blow. She questioned water rights. That's it. She challenged authority, broke the old codes. Vostak's voice carried a finality that Marcus recognized. It was the same tone Commander Hayes used when discussing company policy. Non-negotiable. Another scream echoed across the compound, and Marcus gripped the platform railing. The sound was weaker now, hoarse. How long had this been going on? How long does this ritual last? He asked. 10 sons, Vostak said quietly, chained in the burning ground. No shelter, no water save what rain might fall. If she survives, her debt to order is paid. And if she doesn't? Vostak's silence was answer enough. Marcus stared down at the scene, watching the Zephyrian elders moving through their morning routines as if nothing unusual was happening. Children played nearby, their parents working on daily tasks, all of them seeming to accept the suffering at their center as natural as breathing. "This is the second son," Vostak added, unprompted. "She has endured longer than most expected." The rest of that day passed in a haze of mechanical work and growing horror. Every few hours, Marcus found excuses to return to positions where he could see the settlement center. The girl remained chained, her movements growing more sluggish as the twin suns climbed to their merciless peak. By evening, when the temperature finally began to drop from its hellish noon high, she had stopped moving entirely. That night, Marcus couldn't eat. He sat in the human compound's mess hall, pushing reconstituted protein around his plate, while his colleagues discussed production quotas and equipment maintenance schedules. The normalcy of it felt obscene. "You're quiet tonight, Chen," observed Dr. Sarah Kim, the colony's chief medical officer. "Equipment giving you trouble?" Marcus looked up, meeting her concerned gaze. "The Zephyrians are torturing someone in their settlement. A girl. Have been for 2 days." The conversation at their table stopped. Several heads turned toward him. expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. "It's their justice system," said Lieutenant Torres from the security detail. "Not our business." "She's dying out there," Marcus pressed. "Chained to a post in the desert heat with no water, no shelter, for questioning authority." Commander Hayes spoke from the next table, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Engineer Chen, I trust you remember the terms of our colonial charter. We are guests here. The Syrian Mining Consortium exists by grace of Zephyrian cooperation. We don't interfere in their internal affairs." "But." "No buts." Hayes stood, her compact frame radiating the kind of authority that had kept this remote outpost running for 8 years. "The Zephyrians provide us with mining rights to the richest uranium deposits in this sector. Earth needs that uranium for the new generation of starships. We don't risk that relationship over their cultural practices, no matter how distasteful we might find them." Marcus felt the eyes of his colleagues on him, some sympathetic, others warning him to drop it. He nodded slowly and returned to his untouched meal. But that night, lying in his narrow bunk, he heard her screaming again. The third day was worse. Marcus forced himself to work, calibrating sensors and replacing worn components, but his eyes kept drifting toward the settlement. The girl had found enough strength to lift her head occasionally, her movements painfully slow. The chains around her wrists and ankles had already begun to leave marks on her silver scales. By the fourth day, her voice had changed. The screams had become rasping whimpers that somehow cut deeper than her earlier cries. Marcus watched Zephyrian children playing games within sight of her suffering, their parents continuing their daily routines as if she were simply part of the landscape. "Her name is Caravel," Vostak told him during their lunch break on the 5th day. They sat in the shade of the processing station, sharing water rations and energy bars. It was the first time either had directly mentioned what was happening below them. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus asked. Vostak was quiet for a long moment, his yellow eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "Because she is my nest sister's daughter. Because she asked questions I had wondered about myself, but never dared voice." He paused. "Because I am ashamed." "Then help her." "I cannot. The law is absolute. To interfere would make me outcast. My family with me. We would lose our place in the settlement, our water rights, our protection. We would die in the desert." Marcus understood. The Zephyrians lived in a harsh world where community survival trumped individual life. Their rigid social structure had kept them alive for millennia in one of the galaxy's most unforgiving environments. But understanding didn't make it right. On the 6th day, Caravel stopped making sounds altogether. Marcus watched through his workstation scope as she hung limply from her chains, her silver scales now dulled to a sickly gray. Her chest barely moved with each breath. That evening, he requested a meeting with Commander Hayes. "Sir, I want to formally request medical intervention for the Zephyrian prisoner." Hayes didn't look up from her reports. "Request denied. She's dying." "That's the point of their punishment, Chen. They're not executing her outright, but they're not exactly planning a tea party either. We could at least provide water. We could start a diplomatic incident that ends our mining contract and strands 43 humans on a desert world with no way home." Hayes finally looked at him, her expression mixing irritation with something that might have been sympathy. "I don't like it either, Marcus, but we have our orders, and more importantly, we have our survival to think about." Marcus left the meeting feeling hollow. That night, he stood at his small window, watching the settlement below. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across the central square where Caravel hung motionless. No one watched anymore. The spectacle had become routine, background suffering that the community had learned to ignore. By the 7th day, Marcus could barely function. He went through the motions of his work while his mind raced through possibilities. Every scenario ended the same way: diplomatic crisis, loss of mining rights, 43 humans stranded or evacuated, and his career destroyed. Against that, one young Zephyrian's life, someone he'd never spoken to, never even seen up close. The 8th day brought a sandstorm that forced both communities indoors. Marcus watched through reinforced windows as the wind scoured the settlement, driving stinging particles against every surface. When the storm cleared on the 9th morning, Kiravel still hung from her post, somehow having survived the night's fury. That afternoon, Marcus made his decision. He began his preparations carefully, gathering supplies that wouldn't be missed immediately. Medical kit from the emergency supplies, water purification tablets, energy rations, a portable shelter unit meant for emergency repairs. As the colony's senior engineer, he had access to equipment others couldn't easily obtain. That evening, as the night shift settled into their routines, Marcus Chen walked to his quarters, sealed the door, and began to prepare for the end of his career. The girl had less than 24 hours left in her sentence, assuming she survived that long. In her current state, Marcus doubted she would last another day, which meant if he was going to act, it had to be tonight. He checked the duty roster one final time. The night watch was minimal, focused on perimeter security rather than internal surveillance. The Zephyrian settlement would be nearly empty, most of the population sleeping through the cooler hours before dawn. Marcus sealed his emergency pack, secured his tools, and stepped into the desert night. Above him, Sirian 7's 3 moons cast pale light across the compound. Somewhere in that light, a young woman was dying for the crime of asking questions. Tonight, Marcus Chen would answer her unspoken plea for help, regardless of the cost. The price of compassion. The desert air bit at Marcus's exposed skin as he moved through the shadows between the human compound and the Zephyrian settlement. Sirian 7's night was a study in contrasts. Bitter cold after the day's blazing heat, silence broken by the distant howl of desert predators, and stark moonlight that turned familiar territory alien and treacherous. He had studied the settlement's layout for days, memorizing patrol patterns and noting which buildings stayed lit through the night. The Zephyrians were creatures of habit, their routines carved by generations of survival in this harsh environment. That predictability would either save him or damn him. The central square lay ahead, dominated by the metal post where Kiravel had hung for 9 days. As Marcus crept closer, he could make out her motionless form, silver scales now matte with dust and exposure. For a terrifying moment, he thought he might be too late. Then he saw the faint rise and fall of her chest. 2 guards stood at the settlement's ceremonial entrance, their attention focused outward toward the desert rather than inward toward their community. Marcus had observed this pattern every night. The Zephyrians feared external threats, the native predators, sandstorms, and equipment failures that could kill an entire community. They didn't expect danger from within their ordered society. Moving from shadow to shadow, Marcus approached the square from the east, using a storage building to mask his approach. His heart hammered against his ribs as he knelt beside Kiravel, close enough now to see the devastating effects of her ordeal. Her silver scales had lost their natural luster, dulled to the color of old pewter. The chains had worn raw wounds around her wrists and ankles, the metal stained with her blood. Her breathing was shallow, irregular, the sound of someone whose body was shutting down system by system. "Kiravel," he whispered, unsure if she was even conscious. Her eyes opened, 4 pupilled amber orbs that took long seconds to focus on his face. When they did, her expression shifted from confusion to fear. She had never seen him this close before, had no reason to trust a human face appearing in her final hours. "I'm here to help," Marcus said softly, hoping his tone would convey what his words might not. He began working on the lock mechanism that secured her chains to the post, a complex Zephyrian design that had taken him hours to figure out from stolen glimpses during the day. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet square. Kiravel's eyes widened as Marcus carefully supported her weight, easing the chains from her wrists. She was lighter than he had expected, her body dehydrated and weakened by days of exposure. "Can you walk?" he asked. She tried to respond, but only a whispered croak emerged from her throat. Marcus pulled a water bottle from his pack, helping her take small sips. Too much too fast would make her sick, potentially killing her as surely as the desert heat. A sound from across the square froze them both. One of the guards had turned, beginning his patrol circuit. In minutes, he would pass close enough to see them. Marcus made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. Lifting Caravel into his arms, he ran. The first shout came when they were halfway to the settlement's edge. Marcus didn't look back, focusing all his energy on reaching the desert beyond the community's lights. Behind them, alarm calls echoed through the night air, voices raised in confusion and anger. Caravel's weight seemed to double with each step, but Marcus pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death for both of them. The settlement's edge rushed toward them, marked by the last of the solar collection arrays that powered the community's essential systems. They plunged into the darkness beyond, into the vast desert that stretched to Sirian 7's horizon. Marcus had studied the terrain maps, identifying a canyon system, approximately 2 kilometers northeast, that would provide shelter and concealment. It might as well have been on another planet. The sound of pursuit followed them into the night, vehicles starting, voices coordinating search patterns, the high whine of energy weapons powering up. The entire settlement was mobilizing, their ordered world disrupted by an unprecedented act of interference. Marcus ran until his lungs burned and his legs trembled, finally collapsing behind a cluster of rock formations that offered minimal cover. Caravel had lost consciousness again, her breathing shallow but steady. In the distance, searchlights swept across the desert as Zephyrian pursuit teams spread out from the settlement. "What have I done?" Marcus whispered to himself, the full weight of his actions finally hitting him. He had destroyed his career, endangered his colleagues, and potentially triggered a diplomatic crisis that could affect human-Zephyrian relations across multiple star systems, all for someone he had never even spoken to until tonight. Caravel stirred in his arms, her amber eyes opening to meet his gaze. This time, there was no fear in her expression. She lifted one trembling hand to touch his face, her scales rough and warm against his skin. "Why?" she managed to whisper, the word barely audible. Marcus looked at her, this young woman who had suffered for asking the same questions that had always driven humanity forward. "Because it was wrong," he said simply. "Because no one should die for asking questions." They spent the remaining hours of darkness moving slowly through the rocky terrain, avoiding the search patterns that crisscrossed the desert around the settlement. By dawn, they had reached the canyon system Marcus had identified, a maze of narrow passages carved by centuries of flash floods. In a sheltered alcove protected from the twin suns, Marcus set up the portable shelter and began treating Caravel's injuries properly. The medical supplies he had brought were basic, but they were enough to clean her wounds and begin the process of rehydration. As she grew stronger over the following hours, Caravel began to speak. Her English was limited but improving, and Marcus found himself learning about the person he had risked everything to save. She was 23 years old by Zephyrian standards, a recent graduate of their technical schools, who had been assigned to work on the water distribution systems. The work had shown her inefficiencies in the current allocation methods, disparities that favored the elder families while leaving younger generations with barely adequate supplies. "I spoke truth," she said, her voice gaining strength as the day progressed. "Water flows to sane families always, while young ones make do with less. I said we should measure need, not just age and position." "That's reasonable," Marcus replied, checking her pulse. It was stronger now, more regular. "Not to elders. They said I challenged order that keeps community alive. Said young voices lead to chaos, death and desert." She paused, looking at Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read. "But your people ask questions always, yes. How else do you build machines that clean air, make water from desert moisture?" The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Humanity's greatest strength, their willingness to question, to challenge accepted wisdom, to push boundaries, was being punished in the very person who had tried to apply those principles to her own society. By evening, The immediate search had moved beyond their area, but Marcus knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. He had disabled his personal locator before leaving the compound, but that would only delay the inevitable. Commander Hayes would have reported his absence by now, and both human and Zephyrian authorities would be coordinating their search efforts. What happens now? Caravel asked as they shared another meal of emergency rations. Marcus had been wrestling with that question all day. They couldn't return to the settlement. Caravel would face immediate execution for escaping her punishment, and he would be handed over to human authorities for court-martial. They couldn't survive indefinitely in the desert with limited supplies. "I don't know," he admitted. "I didn't think past getting you away from there." Caravel was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the shelter's dim lighting. "You gave up everything for Stranger," she said finally. "Your people will punish you. Probably. My career is definitely over. I'll likely face criminal charges for violating the Colonial Charter." "I am sorry." Marcus shook his head. "I'm not. What they were doing to you was wrong by any measure that matters. If saving you costs me everything, that's a price I can live with." The next morning brought the sound of approaching vehicles. Marcus had expected this. Their supplies were running low, and both governments would have expanded their search patterns to cover the entire region. As the sound grew closer, he made one final decision. "I'm going to turn myself in," he told Caravel. "You stay hidden until they leave with me, then try to reach the neutral zone near the southern mining settlements. There are human settlements there that might help you." Caravel gripped his arm with surprising strength. "No, we go together. I will speak truth about what happened, why you did this. They won't listen. They will listen. Because what you did, it changes things. Shows that some humans care about right and wrong more than comfortable lies." 3 hours later, Marcus Chen walked out of the canyon with his hands raised, Caravel beside him despite his protests. The joint human-Zephyrian search team that found them included Commander Hayes, Elder Thane-Cole, and Vostak, whose expression when he saw his nest sister's daughter alive was worth every consequence Marcus would face. The aftermath was swift and predictable. Marcus was placed under arrest and transported back to the human compound to await transportation to Earth for court-martial. The diplomatic crisis he had feared began immediately, with Zephyrian authorities demanding his extradition for violating their sovereignty. But something unexpected happened during the long hours of testimony and investigation that followed. Caravel refused to remain silent about her experience, describing not just Marcus's rescue, but the circumstances that had led to her punishment. Her testimony was recorded and transmitted to Zephyrian communities across the sector, sparking debates that had been suppressed for generations. Dr. Sarah Kim's medical examination of Caravel documented injuries that shocked even hardened military officials. The detailed report, complete with photographic evidence, found its way to both Earth authorities and Zephyrian reform movements that had been quietly growing throughout their space. 3 months later, as Marcus sat in a holding cell aboard a transport bound for Earth, he learned that the ritual of the burning sands had been formally abolished by the Zephyrian Council of Elders. Water allocation disputes would now be handled through mediation rather than punishment, and younger community members would have formal voices in resource management decisions. Vostak visited him before the transport departed, bringing news that Caravel had been granted sanctuary in a reformist settlement and was working as an advocate for systemic change throughout Zephyrian space. "She asks me to tell you that questions are being asked throughout our worlds now," Vostak said. "Young voices speaking truths that were forbidden before. She says this is the gift you gave her, not just life, but the right to keep asking questions." Marcus's court-martial proceedings on Earth lasted 6 weeks. The charges were serious: violation of the Colonial Charter, interference in alien sovereign affairs, and endangering diplomatic relations. The evidence was overwhelming, and Marcus pled guilty to all charges. But the case had attracted attention from human rights organizations, colonial reform movements, and media outlets across Earth's sphere of influence. The testimony of witnesses, including Kira Vel herself via subspace communication, painted a picture of institutional cowardice in the face of obvious moral crisis. The final sentence was 18 months of confinement and dishonorable discharge from colonial service. Marcus had expected worse. What he hadn't expected was the job offer waiting for him upon his release. The Interspecies Ethics Institute, a newly formed organization dedicated to preventing cultural conflicts in human expansion zones, offered him a position as a field investigator. His first assignment would be returning to Xerion 7 to help establish new protocols for cultural exchange that balanced respect for alien customs with fundamental ethical principles. 6 months later, Marcus Chen stood once again on the platform of an atmospheric processing station, watching the desert world spread out below him. But this time, the Zephyrian settlement beyond showed signs of change. New structures house arbitration centers, where disputes were resolved through discussion rather than punishment. Young Zephyrians moved freely through the community, their voices heard in councils that had once excluded them entirely. In the center of the settlement, where a metal post had once stood as a monument to rigid tradition, a garden grew. Kira Vel had planted it herself. She had told him during their reunion the day before. Native desert flowers that bloomed in the brief cool of dawn and dusk, their colors brilliant against the harsh landscape. She said it represents questions blooming in places where only silence grew before. Vostak had translated, his own pride in his nest sister's daughter evident in every word. Marcus had paid a heavy price for his moment of compassion, his career, his reputation, and months of his freedom. But as he watched young Zephyrians tending the garden below, he knew he would make the same choice again. Sometimes the cost of doing right was worth everything you had to give. In the desert wind that always swept across Xerion 7, he could swear he heard the sound of questions being asked, of young voices refusing to be silenced, of a universe slowly becoming more just because one person had decided that some things mattered more than protocol. The girl had screamed for 10 days while others watched and did nothing. But her silence had lasted only until someone found the courage to act, and that, Marcus reflected, made all the difference in the galaxy.